in the Western Rite, there's a sense that sort of everybody's looking the same direction, and that everybody's looking at the priest who's mediating with God, and everybody's looking at the crucifix, the altar cross or the rood, where Christ, in his posture of crucifixion, is mediating with God. And there's this very sense that the movement is forward to the altar, priest and crucifix, and then upward to God, who's up there above the church. And so a Western church has those two axes, it's forward and it's up. And even in the wording of the prayers, like every prayer in the Western church ends through Jesus Christ our Lord. Jesus Christ is mediating every intercession. It goes to the crucifix. By his action of being dead on the cross, he reconciles us to God, and thus, through Jesus Christ our Lord on the cross, up the prayer goes to God, who's not in our space, he's up above our space. That's totally different from an Orthodox liturgy. In an Orthodox liturgy, the idea is that the inside of the church is an icon of the kingdom of heaven. Heaven is there. You're standing in the middle of it.
Hello everyone, and today I'm welcoming Andrew Gould, who is an architectural designer based here in Charleston, South Carolina, who grew up Anglican, was an Anglo-Catholic organist, and then eventually converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, and in my estimation is the foremost pioneer of traditional building in Orthodox architecture in North America. And thank you for being here, Andrew.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, do you agree with my assessment? Are you the foremost pioneer?
Oh dear. Well, it would be better if I were British. I was recently listening to a lecture by Douglas Murray, and Barry Weiss was introducing him, and she said, because Douglas is British, he can't possibly withstand a compliment, but I'm going to give him some anyway.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Well, I must say I have noticed, I often look at other Orthodox churches, perhaps online, and there will be little silly things like the air vent will be over the altar. It's like, why is the air vent over the altar? Where it's just, can it be in a slightly less conspicuous place? Or I'll see these buildings which the facade looks great, or maybe the iconography inside is amazing, but you can tell the materials that it's built with is just regular construction materials, plywood, nothing special, not traditional stone masonry. So how does that make you feel when you see vents over an altar in the most conspicuous place possible?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one annoying detail out of, a million bad decisions that I typically see when I go in, and pretty much any new church. Yeah, it's frustrating to me. I mean, I absolutely love Orthodoxy and Orthodox churches because it can be so beautiful at its best. So I go to Europe and I visit, these wonderful ancient monasteries, and oftentimes they have wonderful liturgics, beautiful music in these places, and I see Orthodoxy in its fullness and at its best. which is, truly a marvel. And then I'll come back to America and I'll visit a typical parish, and, the building seems absolutely terrible to me. It's just steel and sheetrock, and every single thing about it is cold and modern and poorly considered, and oftentimes on top of that, the music is bad as well. And, it seems like a tragedy. And yet, these churches are full of happy people who think everything is just as beautiful as can be. That actually always puzzled me. I got some insights recently. I was watching a YouTube video where an atheist goes to different churches and sort of posts reviews of what he thought the church service was like.
I think I've seen that guy.
Yeah,
it's really interesting.
Yeah, I like his channel. And so he went to an Orthodox church and gave it a fantastic review. And when I heard which church he went to, I thought, oh no, why did he go to that one? That church is actually one of my clients. I've been designing a lot of beautification for them to try to make that church better, because it's not that good right now. And I was a little bit embarrassed that this guy is getting his first impression of an Orthodox temple from this kind of cheap building. And yet I watch his presentation and I realize he's not comparing it to medieval monastery churches in Europe. He's comparing it to the Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall that he went to last week, and to the Mormon church that he went to the week before that, and to the evangelical megachurch that he grew up in. And so to him, when he goes in this modern suburban Orthodox church, he's saying, look at that, they actually made some effort to make it beautiful. Like, they actually put up some paintings on the walls, and the clergy actually wear some pretty fabric as their vestments, and the choir is actually singing some music that sounds kind of ancient and reverent, and the hymnography texts, actually praise God in a dignified way.
Right.
And I think of these as like lowest common denominator standards, but to him this is more of all of those things than he's ever seen in those other kinds of churches.
Even when it's not good.
So hearing that perspective helped me to understand, this is why people are flocking to Orthodoxy and are happy as a clam in these kind of modern suburban parishes, despite their many shortcomings, is because it's still so much better than what they're used to from where they came from.
Yeah, that makes sense. At least there's some path towards beauty. It does beg the question, which is more important, the music or the architecture itself? Because it is kind of striking to me that there are so many Orthodox churches who will think nothing of hiring a full-time iconographer or spending $100,000 on some iconography. But the idea of even a part-time choir director is almost anathema. And why would we ever pay a choir director a full-time salary? I mean, there's almost none. I mean, a friend Hamilton has has one, but it's like the only one that I know in the entirety of the South.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. In terms of which is more important, I mean, I would definitely say good music is more important than good architecture, because you can attend a service in an ugly building and kind of close your eyes and not think about how it looks, but you're not going to go to a service with bad music and block your ears and forget how it sounds. That's not realistic. The music is more of a constant presence on your state of mind than the architecture is.
Right.
Yeah, so I am frustrated because I'll often, I do a lot of consultancy work where an existing church that's got a building, will hire me to come in and review their building and make advice on like new chandeliers, paint more icons, better furniture, something like that. And, and their building might already look pretty good. It might be a historic building, from 100 years ago that's not bad. but then the music sounds terrible. And, what I really want to tell them is, rather than spending $50,000 on a new chandelier, you should spend $50,000, on bringing in a real choir director who can turn this musical situation around. That would be much more impactful on the beauty of your services. And I sometimes make this as a sort of casual remark, because I know that's not the kind of advice they're paying me for, but they don't want to hear that, because it's not just a financial problem, it's a big political problem in the parish. The choir's volunteers, and they've sung that way forever, and for some credentialed expert to come in and tell them they've been singing wrong their whole life and they're going to have to learn all this new repertoire, that can destroy a parish, and the priests are very wary of that kind of interference in the choir for this reason. Whereas, paying me to pick out new chandeliers or paying an iconographer to paint something pretty on the walls, that's non-controversial.
Right. Yeah, but it really matters. I mean, I've come to Holy Ascension and it just be absolutely gorgeous at times, when there's a strong choir that day. And then I've been out of town on vacation. I thought, I'll visit the Orthodox church this weekend. I don't have to play anywhere. And then go somewhere and the music is just atrocious. And it's like, it's like, I don't know, not that long ago I saw an amazing Rachmaninoff Vespers service done in the midst of a Greek service where none of them knew how to do Byzantine chant.
Mm-hmm.
And the service just went on for like 3 hours. And I thought, and I knew some agnostics who were in the choir singing the Rachmaninoff Vespers. This was a special thing for them. And I just thought, come on, that's not Orthodoxy. Please, that's not the best that Orthodoxy can give. So one of the singers, I actually sent them a Capella Romana, the Byzantine Divine Liturgy, and she was astounded. She said, whoa, that actually is really cool. Like, I've never heard anything like that. And I'm like, the sounds you produce are just as important as the building that you have. I totally agree. And you were a choir director, right? You used to be the choir director at Holy Ascension.
Yeah. I'm a musician of sorts myself, and so I'm very sensitive to that. And well, I'll tell you an analogy to the architecture. What I always tell my clients is do what's within your means that you can do really well. Don't overreach and do stuff that's beyond your means and do it in a poor, fake way. So in church design, that would be like, if you've only got $1 million or $2 million to spend on your building, don't try to build Hagia Sophia, because you're going to end up with a really fakey styrofoam and sheetrock version of Hagia Sophia with a fiberglass dome on the roof, and it's going to be a really embarrassing building. That doesn't mean you can't build a good church for that kind of money, but it probably means you should be building like a simple wooden country church that's honest about being, simple and humble, but build it authentically. If it's going to be a wooden building, show off the wood, use wood siding, use tongue and groove paneling, and we see this in historic architecture, of course. There's the great cathedrals, but the old world is also full of little villages that built very humble wooden village churches. America is full of, little country churches, and they're wonderful, beautiful buildings because they stick to a certain simplicity and humility that is within their means to do well. And it's a similar situation with church music. It's, if you're an Orthodox church, singing Byzantine chant like they sing on Mount Athos might be your sort of highest aspiration. Or if you're a Slavic parish, singing Rachmaninoff and Chesnikov and so forth, the way a professional choir in a Russian cathedral would sing, might be the highest expression of your liturgical style. But if you can't do it, don't try to do it.
Right.
It's like the Greek church you mentioned. Yeah, if they don't have any properly trained Byzantine chanters, maybe they shouldn't be singing Byzantine chant. Maybe they should think of something that's very simple that they can do reasonably well.
And there are two-part settings for the Orthodox that are great. It's like it's not that hard to use, and it's elegant and simple and beautiful. Yeah.
Absolutely true. Well, and of course, you know from Western church music that this is what I'm describing is traditional. That like what an Anglican cathedral has their professional boy choir sing is not the same as what a little Episcopalian country parish has their congregation sing. They're completely different repertoires because they're suited to the vocal resources and the talent available to them.
Right. Yeah, and beautiful isn't always necessarily complicated. Sometimes simple can be beautiful. Well, speaking of, and especially speaking of not building with like fake materials, what can you say about churches that say, well, we really want to build, this awesome Romanesque basilica style building, which kind of looks traditional and has all of the features and attributes of maybe Romanesque or Neo-Gothic, but the material that it's made of is just steel and cheap materials, not the traditional materials. What's the difference between the two, and what's your best argument for why people should use traditional materials? Because I know that's one of your big things, right?
Sure. Well, it's obvious looking at historical architecture that design and form derives from the structural characteristics of the material. For instance, one builds thick walls with blocky shapes out of stone, and if you need to span with stone, it has to be an arch, because a stone lintel can't span very far. And churches that were built out of masonry, brick or stone, tend to be full vaulted, arched buildings. They have domes, they have barrel vaults, they have arched windows, and they get thicker and thicker as you go down, and they often have buttresses. And all of these things make structural sense when you're building out of unreinforced masonry. In contrast, when old churches use timber, it's all straight lines and trusses, because trees grow straight and wood is strong in a straight timber, and if you need to span a big space, you have to make a truss with a bunch of triangles. You can't do that in stone. And we can see that the beauty of historic architecture substantially lies in the fact that these buildings are a rational expression of the quality of the materials, how you work with them, and how they're able to enclose space efficiently. So in modern construction, we should always hesitate when we're pursuing the idea of using one material to imitate a completely different material, like building out of a steel frame and then covering it up with lath and plaster to make it look like load-bearing masonry. It's not to say there's never a justification for doing that. I've occasionally done things like that in my own work, but I try not to do an entire building like that. I try to choose materials that mostly align with the form and structural expression of the building, so that it has a degree of integrity and authenticity to it.
What do you think of columns that are painted to look like marble?
Well, it so depends on how convincing is the artifice, and whether it's done sort of with the intent to deceive. So what I mean by that is, if you go in a church and you think the columns really are marble because they've been marbleized really convincingly, and then you go up really close to them and you can see that like the paint is scratched where a chair rubbed up against it, and you can see that it's just plaster underneath, then it's a big disappointment. Then you're like, oh, I thought this was a really fine church, but it tricked me. It's disappointing when you see that. And there's lots of churches like that. Particularly like 19th century Catholic churches tend to be full of photorealistic marbleizing that you get up close and you realize it's fake. On the other hand, what I really enjoy is marbleizing that in no way is trying to trick you. Marbleizing where it's immediately clear that this is a plastered wall and the fresco artist is kind of referencing the old marble paneling of early Christian architecture, as a decorative historical reference. But the marbleizing is not realistic. It's not tricking you. It's obviously fresco on plaster. And this is what we see in medieval churches. I've been to lots of famous medieval Orthodox churches, and older Catholic churches for that matter, that have lots of marbleizing in the fresco scheme, but it would never trick anybody. You can instantly see that it's simply part of the fresco scheme. And I find that very charming. Just recently I was at one of the Spanish missions in California, a church built in 1812, and it's full of marbleizing, but the marbleizing is crazy unrealistic. It's like, it looks more like sort of, big colorful splotches, like a crazy leopard print. It's like, it hardly actually looks like marble, but it's got a wonderful sort of naive, joyful charm about it. It was probably painted by Native Americans who lived at the mission, who had never even actually seen real marble, except maybe in book illustrations. And, that can be wonderful.
Okay. Well, so would the same principle then apply to your assessment of, a steel-framed building that's trying to look as though it's built with masonry? Or is there a parallel? So, the idea of deception, like if it's trying to deceive you rather than...
Yeah.
Well,
I'll give you an example from my own work. I designed the monastery church of St. Gregory Palamas Monastery in Ohio. It's a Greek Orthodox monastery.
Did Grigorenko do the iconography there?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, yeah, I've seen pictures of it. It's great.
So the monks there really wanted a fully plastered, domed, and vaulted interior, like an old church on Mount Athos would have. And they wanted that for a good reason. It was because they wanted to be able to have a very complex fresco scheme where there's many, many surfaces on the ceiling, surfaces that are facing each other, surfaces that arch over. And in Orthodox iconography, these very complex church interiors are able to make use of all of those surfaces with interesting theological relationships among the icons. You can have an Old Testament prophet and a New Testament figure who relate to each other, facing each other. You can place sort of parallel feasts like the Nativity of Christ and the Resurrection of Christ facing each other. And you have all these different tiers for Old Testament stuff, New Testament stuff, post-biblical stuff in different layers. And so Orthodox churches that intend to do a complete fresco scheme often want a Byzantine form to the architecture, so they can have that traditional complexity. And especially a monastery wants that, because monks spend much of their life sitting in church, and they want to have a lot of different stuff to look at and contemplate, basically. But on the other hand, these monks wanted to build the church out of wood, partially because they're on a farm in Amish country, and all of the architecture in their area is wood construction, partly just because they were in kind of a hurry to build it. And so I told them, all right, I'll design you a church that's got all of these plastered surfaces inside, but I'm also going to make it really clear that it's a wood building. So the 4 columns that are holding up the dome, I made out of wood. They're varnished, lathe-turned timbers. Normally in a Greek church, these would be marble columns. And then I made some of the ceilings in sort of unimportant corner spaces, tongue and groove wood ceilings. And then the whole outside of the church is clad in wood siding with wood rafter tails. So because of this, it's incredibly clear, both inside and out, that this is a wood building, and that the plastered domes and arches are a hollow lath construction that are there to hold beautiful frescoes. And I think that worked really well. It achieved everything the monks wanted, but without any suggestion of deceit or imitation.
Right. That makes sense. It's not trying to pretend to be something it's not.
Yeah.
You know, I saw the other day some company in Europe somewhere who has these ridiculous AI engineered robots who make sculptures that look as though they're Baroque sculptures. And so they're making these incredibly intricate sculptures and then shipping them to put in churches all over Europe. And they were sort of thought this was an amazing thing because it was bringing back beauty to sometimes otherwise super ugly churches, and it was sort of turning a corner into trying to make more beautiful things again. But there's something that seems super fake about that to me, and so I don't know what to do with it. How do you feel about the concept of extremely intricate AI engineered architectural ornamentation and statuary? I mean, I know Orthodox don't use statuary, but...
Yeah, well, it's a very case-by-case question. I have no objection to robotics being used to help make ornament in general. Like, for instance, I specialize in making Byzantine-style chandeliers, which are all made of sort of kind of lacy open fretwork cut out of steel. And historically, these pieces were lost wax cast bronze, which is a very expensive way to make a large metal element. In order to keep the cost down, I make these fretwork panels using a robotic laser cutting machine. I draw the parts in AutoCAD and I send them off to a robotic facility that can cut them out of sheet steel. And it's perfectly suited to the medium because, you know, it's a sheet of metal with holes cut out of it. You don't really care how the holes were cut out. So it's not really limiting the design or the craftsmanship of the piece. On the other hand, you know, I have different feelings when you're working with wood, for instance, because, well, laser cut wood, you can laser cut wood, but you can't really sculpt with laser cutting. All you can do is cut out fretwork, and with wood it burns the edges. You get black edges. So I see a lot of crafty things, you know, like stuff on Etsy and stuff in gift shops nowadays that's made out of robotically laser cut wood, and they just kind of allow the black edges of that fretwork to show, and they're really limiting their design because they're reducing ornaments that should be fully sculpted and hand carved to just like a flat picture of an ornament, because they can only do essentially a two-dimensional design with their laser cutter. And so I feel like these craftsmen, they're really limiting their design, and they're compromising their product with these burnt edges by using a laser cutter. And that, I think, is a shame. I think, you know, guys, you should really just get some carving chisels and learn how to carve those ornaments. It wouldn't be that hard to do it right, and it would be better work.
But what about statuary? Like humongous, you know, Moses with the horns. Looks like Michelangelo, but it's not Michelangelo.
Yeah, well, again, it's case by case. So a CNC grinding machine on a robotic arm, like they used to make these statues, it's not really carving, it's grinding. It's got a rotary bit, and that means it's fine at roughing out a shape, but it also means it can't get all the way into the detail. So when you look at carvings, whether they're wood or stone, that are CNC carved like that, they're quite disappointing if you get up close to them, because all of the inside corners, you know, that should come to a sharp V, they're all rounded because the rotary bit can't get all the way into these details.
Okay.
And like in Russian Orthodoxy right now, there's a fashion for CNC carved wood icons. Somebody uses like a robotic router to sculpt a thick piece of wood into a carved icon. And it's like, from 50 feet away, you think, wow, look at that fantastic carved icon, because it's copied from something a real artist made. You get up close to it, and everything looks really soft and squishy, and the surface is slightly fuzzy, because it wasn't actually carved. It was ground with a rotary bit, and it doesn't have it neither has the fine detail, nor does it have the sort of burnished surface that a real carving chisel leaves on the surface of carved wood. So again, like that I object to, because they're compromising the quality by using a robot. However, real wood carvers, professional wood carvers who do top-notch work, they also use a robot, but they just don't use it to finish the carving. They just use it to start the carving. So I work with a professional wood carver here in Charleston who's very good, and yeah, he has one of those robot carvers in his shop, and if it's a big, thick carving that would take him, all day of hammer to rough that shape out, sure, he'll 3D model it on the computer. He'll have his robot carver come in with its grinding wheel and, spend all night roughing that thing out. But he'll have it, rough it out to within 1/8 of an inch proud of the finished surface. And then he'll take it to his workbench with his hand tools, and he'll completely go over it by hand, so that the finished carving is entirely hand carved and looks just like it would if he had done it completely by hand. That's fine. It's not compromising the art or the quality.
So it sounds like utilizing robotics and AI isn't a problem for you. But hypothetically, if it's the whole thing, and let's say it was exquisite and you couldn't tell any difference whatsoever between that and some ancient Greek statuary, like some remarkable statuary or carving, and you had absolutely no idea, just looking at it, that it wasn't done by a human, then how would you feel about it?
Well,
sorry for the hypothetical, but I'm curious.
Yeah, well, of course it's disappointing when you learn that fact about a work of art. It's, there's authenticity and human touch is a major element of art. I mean, consider the fact that, an original painting by Monet is worth $50 million, and the poster they sell in the gift shop that looks almost exactly the same is worth $1. It's like, that's a 50 million fold difference between the original Monet made and the copy that looks almost the same. So that's pretty serious difference. And yeah, it's the same with the marble sculpture. The ancient Roman original is infinitely more valuable than the robotically made copy. It's even more valuable than the human-made copy. Some 19th century Italian copy of a Roman sculpture is not worth anything like as much as the original Roman sculpture, though it's still worth a lot more than the robot-made copy. So yeah, in terms of, people put their money where their mouth is, and, the valuation of art pretty much tells you what that art's actual artistic worth is.
But let's say
on the other hand, do I think there's no place for robotically made Catholic sculptures? No, I don't think there's no place for it. I mean, consider the fact that your average 19th century American church is full of plaster sculptures that are molded and copied from originals, in Europe that are made of wood or stone. That's the 19th century version of what you're talking about. Does it bother me that there's plaster casts that are sort of painted to look real in 19th century Catholic churches? It doesn't bother me because I know what they are. I know that they're plaster casts, and if you sold those sculptures, they might be worth a few $100s compared to the European originals that might be worth $100,000. But it's still nice that the churches have them. They're still beautiful sculptures. They're still better than nothing. So I guess I would feel the same way about the robot carved sculpture. It's kind of the new version of a plaster cast. If they're not very expensive, if people understand that they are what they are, that they're just copies for churches that don't have very much money, and nobody's passing them off as original artworks, yeah, I think it's okay. Though,
Then I guess it's sort of the old question too. Like, I'm sure it'd be the same with that statuary you're talking about there. Does it then mean that sculptors don't have enough work and there's fewer sculptors, so we have less great statuary?
that can be a risk. Although at the moment we have virtually no good sculptors in the world, and they get virtually no good commissions. I think, yeah, there's really very, very few sculptors in the world right now who can actually do a good sculpture by classical standards. And those sculptors that we do have like that, they tend to get commissioned by, governments and major arts organizations to do rather prominent work, that's going to be unveiled in a public ceremony and so forth. So it's like the robots are not competing with commissions like that.
Right.
So
that makes sense.
There will always be prominent commissions, by institutions of prestige, who are only ever going to commission a real sculptor to make a real piece of art. They're never going to consider the robots.
Okay, fair enough.
I think that's the case, at least with sculptors. Iconographers, I think, have more cause to complain, because it's like we do have quite a few good iconographers, and they really are actually in competition with printed icons. I'm
So are you anti-printed icon?
Broadly speaking, yes. And I don't think there's anything wrong with a paper reproduction of an icon image, like a postcard or a prayer card, something that's honestly what it is, just a sheet of paper of minimal monetary value. That's fine. If I go to a museum or a monastery and they're selling a postcard of a beautiful icon, sure, I'll pay 50 cents for the postcard and I'll enjoy it. But I'm not pretending that that's actually an icon. It's a postcard of an icon. What I object to is when people glue that photograph to a wooden board and paint the edges red and present it as some special holy thing and charge $40 for it. And it's that's what's undermining real iconography, because it's Orthodox people will go to bookstores and they'll buy a bunch of those icons, and before long they'll have a whole icon corner full of these printed icons, and they spent, $500 on buying 10 or 20 printed icons. And it's you shouldn't have done that. You should have saved up that $500 and commissioned a real iconographer to paint one real icon. Then you'd have an actual holy object that was sacramentally made by a real human being and is a unique original work of art. That would be infinitely more precious than your 15 printed icons that cost the same amount of money.
So are you saying those wouldn't be holy icons then? Because aren't there some printed icons that are wonderworking icons?
Yes, there are. And holiness is not intrinsic to the object. Holiness means how we treat the object. We make something a holy object by treating it as such, by setting it apart for worship. So sure, if a church uses a printed icon liturgically and the priest carries it out and puts it on the icon stand and people come up and venerate it and kiss it, absolutely it's a holy object, because we are treating it as a holy object. However, it's better if there's a confluence between sort of the artistic and sacramental process of a human being making an icon as a precious offering of time and talent, using precious materials, real pigments and so forth. There should be a confluence between all of that beauty and meaning and sacramentality and the liturgical use of the object in church.
Sure.
If you know what I mean. It's best if you have both of those things. If the object was beautifully made with love as an offering of somebody's talents and as an offering of precious materials, and it's then put on the icon stand and it's treated as holy and people are kissing it in church, that's the ideal. It's you can lose either one of those and it's still an icon. It can be a worthless paper print and people are treating it as holy. It's still liturgically holy, but you've lost something. On the flip side, you can take the real icon, the real beautiful painting, and you can hang it in an art museum where it's not being used liturgically. It's just being used for people to look at in a secular context. It's still an icon. It still has all the artistic value, but it likewise has lost something.
Yeah, when I was in Prague, I was in the art museum, and there was all these amazing old Russian icons, and I just thought, I'm supposed to kiss it. That's what I'm supposed to do. I don't know what to do here. This is really awkward.
Yeah.
It just felt wrong. It's like, this is not where this should be.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, when we say, I don't want to say wrong. I'd rather say it's not the fullness, because it's absolutely not wrong to put museums in icons. Museums form a very important service by taking fragile ancient icons, putting lots of effort into conserving them to the highest scientific standards so they don't deteriorate any further, and displaying them so that artists and academics can come and study them and properly understand the canonical history of ancient icons. That's a very important service museums provide, and I would never belittle that. I'm very glad that museums protect and curate some of our most important ancient icons. But that doesn't change the fact that the icon has lost something by being taken out of service in worship.
Right. Like we have some silver here that's from the 1700s that often gets loaned to museums, but it still does come back and gets used during Eucharist as well. So it's like it's on loan and then it's not on loan, and so I don't know. Maybe I wish it was the same with iconography. That would be better than just.
Occasionally, it is the same with iconography. I have certainly seen in Russia partnership arrangements between museums and churches where they try to achieve both of those things at once. For instance, there's a famous Russian icon, the I think it's called the Virgin of the Dawn. It's just like 1,000-year-old icon, and it's in Moscow, and it's both in a church and it's in the Trekiatov Gallery. So if you buy your ticket to the Trekiatov Gallery, you can go through a passage that connects the art museum to this church next door, and then you can go into the church, and the icon is displayed in a hermetically sealed case behind bulletproof glass in the church, but it's up at the front where you can get a good look at it, and it's well lit. And so if you're going to the museum as a appreciator of art and you want to go look at the icon as an art piece, you can do that. But then it's also displayed in a church, and on Sunday they have services in that church, and it's there in the church service. So, it's such an important icon, both from a sort of religious history of Russia standpoint and as an art piece. It's such an important icon by both of those measures that they had to work out that compromise.
But it sort of needs both.
Yeah, and there's lots of famous ancient icons in Russian churches that are sort of museum curators and conservators are responsible for taking care of the icon and maintaining its hermetically sealed case. But then the church also is able to use that icon and take it around the city on its annual procession if it's a miracle working icon that has that tradition. So yeah, it's possible to achieve both of those things.
Sure. Well, switching gears a little bit, I wanted to ask you, you do a lot of did a lot of historic preservation work. In fact, there's a lot of awesome houses around Charleston that sort of have your name on it that you helped renovate or helped design. But then you also do churches. Which did you do? Have you always done both together? Do you still do both now? And which came first, and how did you sort of find your preference?
Well, unusually, my very first commission when I graduated from architecture school was Holy Ascension Orthodox Church, my parish here in Charleston. So yeah, a church was actually the very first real building I ever designed.
Hmm.
And I've had an uninterrupted stream of church commissions ever since then. So I've been really fortunate in being able to do do exactly what I always dreamed of doing, which was designing beautiful churches. Um, but the residential work, it came, not long after at all. Even while we were working on Holy Ascension, I was already being asked to design residential structures in Charleston. So, yeah, for my 20 years that I've been practicing, I've pretty much always done the two side by side. And the residential work it's a good complement to the church work, because the church work is slow. Church projects are very stop and start. They don't have
Okay.
the money. They want to get a design on paper, but they don't have the money to build it. So there's often years of waiting and years of rethinking before it actually gets built. And even after it's built, the project still lingers for years as we're adding in furnishings and beautification projects and so forth. So yeah, church projects never have a clear beginning or a clear end, and I'm still working on churches that I designed 15 years ago in many cases. And so that makes them an unreliable basis of income on which to run a business.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah, because they're big, complicated projects that often get put on hold for 5 years and then suddenly restart. Um, on the other hand, residential work is kind of fast paced and predictable, particularly because in Charleston I mostly work for developers, not for homeowners.
Oh,
My
okay.
my typical residential project in Charleston is a developer will buy a lot that's got a rundown old house on it and some room in the backyard, and he'll want me to restore the old house according to the preservation standards that are required in Charleston, and then build a couple of new houses in the backyard that he can rent out as vacation rentals. That's my typical downtown Charleston project.
Now,
And
aesthetically, is there crossover? Like, do you pick up things doing residential work that become super influential for your church work and vice versa? Because I will say I was at Mugdock
yes,
Castle for the first time actually this week. We had a retreat over there, and I noticed under the back, I don't know what the name of the columns are, but they looked like them sort of Roman columns with the triangular shape on top, which I'm pretty sure the same columns are over at Holy Ascension.
yes,
And I thought, oh, that's church architecture right there, you
yeah,
know.
for sure,
So
for
what's the
sure.
overlap?
Yeah, for sure, there's a lot of overlap. I mean, particularly when I'm designing a sort of medieval masonry style house like Mugdock Castle. Yeah, it's built exactly the same as my churches, and I copy many of the same details between the buildings. That even happens with my residential design. Even like a Charleston wooden house. I've designed so many wooden staircases that I want to look like historic American staircases, figuring out, newel posts and balustrades and so forth with detailing that I like. That kind of stuff has absolutely influenced my church architecture, because if I design a church that's got, a loft in the back and a wooden staircase up to the loft, yeah, I'm absolutely using a lot of those same newel post and balustrade details that I developed in my residential work.
Interesting. Interesting. So there does seem to be some
Yeah,
overlap.
and I'm also fond of timber framing in both spheres. I've designed quite a few timber frame houses and timber frame commercial buildings, and I've also designed timber frame churches, timber frame parish halls. Even my masonry churches usually have a timber frame truss roof on top, and so yeah, that's absolutely the same kind of detailing that I'm using in both areas.
The beer exchange was timber framing, right?
Yeah, it's a masonry shell with a timber frame interior and a cupola on top. And yeah, it's that building has all of the same construction systems and details that I use in my churches. Absolutely.
Yeah, I remember you telling the story of when they opened, people would come in and they would suddenly be quiet because it almost
Hmm.
felt like it was sacred.
That's right. That's right.
But
And
they are no longer a beer store anymore, so how do you feel about that?
well, yeah, that's regrettable. I guess they weren't making enough money selling beer and wine there, and they've turned it into a rental event venue. Yeah, I'm disappointed by that, but that experience makes me grateful that I don't do very much secular commercial architecture. I've done some. I've done some work on like a restaurant interior now and then, and it's like, yeah, I don't like that kind of work because on the one hand it's got to be really good, but on the other hand that restaurant's probably only going to be in business 5 years before it closes and somebody remodels it for some other concept. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'm very glad to be mainly in the business of designing churches because churches have a kind of longevity that no other building type has. If we get
Right.
a church right and it's really beautiful, chances are it's still going to look that way in 100 years.
What are some of your favorite buildings in Charleston? And I guess especially like colonial churches. I know you're a fan of St. Michael's, but
I am indeed. It's probably no secret that I have a great love of Baroque architecture, especially English Baroque. So yeah, and any sort of colonial American church of that vintage, like St. Michael's, I'm very fond of. Another one that I really, really like downtown is St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, which is like a smaller and humbler version of St. Michael's, but it has a really, really beautiful 18th century interior. Um,
just because I know that there will probably be some parishioners from St. Michael's that will listen to this, what do you love about the architecture of St. Michael's? Like, what specific aspects pop out that give it the charm that you dig?
ah, well, charm is a good word for it because on the one hand, 18th century colonial American churches, one looks much the same as they are as the next. They've all got a white painted interior that's got a wraparound balcony, and a steeple in the front. So, in many ways, St. Michael's is a typical colonial American church. Of course, it has some very special features. Like its steeple bell tower is remarkably grand and Baroque by American standards and has a remarkable set of bells in it. That really stands out among all colonial American churches as something that's above the rest.
Mm-hmm.
But the things that make St. Michael's really charming are its small scale details and its quirks. I adore the giant pulpit in the front of the church. The pulpit at St. Michael's is ridiculous. It's almost like a ship sailing down the nave. It's this enormous vertical construction that seems rather arbitrarily placed, sort of a third of the way up the nave and off to one side. And it blocks the view of the altar from half the church. Half the church. All you see is this enormous pulpit blocking your view. And I just love that. It's totally impractical by the modern conceptions of how a church is used, but it's charming and archaic. It really makes you feel like you can just look at the pulpit and feel what a Protestant service in the 18th century was like, where it was almost all about the sermon. Everybody
Mm-hmm.
sat in these box pews gathered around this huge pulpit, and the minister would preach for hours and hours and was very much the center of it. It's very evocative of that period of Christian history. And just as a piece of furniture, the pulpit is really beautiful. It's beautiful old polished mahogany with marquetry inlay, and yeah, it's just got tremendous character. I'm so glad that it never suffered, being removed during some modernization campaign, because it's amazing that it hasn't. The chandeliers, likewise, the chandeliers are wonderful original antiques in St. Michael's. They're some of the most beautiful antique brass chandeliers you'll ever see. And then, and the box pews, of course, have beautiful original character. The baptismal font, has wonderful patina and historic character. All of these things are what make the church special and distinctive. And then St. Michael's has something that's really unusual for a church of that vintage, which is that Louis Comfort Tiffany came in and painted a bunch of sort of Byzantine revival ornamentation in the apse over the altar, and put in some really beautiful Tiffany stained glass windows. Those, of course, are things that don't fit in with colonial Protestant architecture at all, and they were put in to kind of, bring in some color, because, in the early 20th century, the Episcopal Church was, Oxford movement, interested in more sort of color and medieval aesthetics, and a certain, visual richness that a colonial era church didn't have.
Yeah, evidently some people have not liked some of those things. So, for example, there was one infamous rector who actually put up a curtain over the devil on the stained glass window.
Yeah.
So for like a decade or more, everyone could see St. Michael, but they couldn't see St. Michael stabbing the dragon because the dragon
Oh, wow.
was inappropriate and no one could see it. There was a little curtain there.
Yes, well, great art does not please everyone, almost by definition. If your art pleases everyone, that's usually a sign that it's bland and boring.
Fair enough. Yeah. I was doing a tour of St. Philip's the other day because I was doing some work over there with this hymnal-ish thing, which was great experience. But in the process of this tour, one of the priests over there, Brian McGreevy, was pointing at the ornamentation and saying that up near the top, it was a lot of pomegranate flowers. Do you know anything about the pomegranate flower ornamentation? And if it's the same at St. Michael's, I think it's the same. Like, it looks the same, but evidently it has some symbolic connection with the law of Moses and something like this. I just didn't,
Yes.
It's a pretty niche detail, so I didn't know if you knew anything about that or not.
I mean, yeah, pomegranates definitely crop up in ornamentation because they relate to various parables and biblical interpretation, to be sure. There's a theory that the fruit in the Garden of Eden that was a pomegranate, not an apple. It doesn't really matter whether that theory was true, but it's a theory that kicks around, so it's used as a justification for pomegranate ornaments, among other things. There's lots of sort of parable stories that relate to them, along with pineapples and apples and many other things that you see in architectural ornament. And classical architecture like St. Philip's or St. Michael's actually has a relatively limited opportunity for symbolic ornament. They don't have any iconography. There's not like big paintings in these churches the way there would be in a Catholic or an Orthodox church. So iconography tends to crop up as these very minor symbols. You'll see like the pelican piercing its breast somewhere in the ornamentation. You might see grape leaves and wheat stalks representing the bread and the wine of the Eucharist. These kind of very minor ornamentation, these very minor symbolic connections, are typically what you see permitted in classical architecture, because they don't really permit themselves a full-blown expression of storytelling in that kind of iconoclastic Protestant architecture.
Interesting. We're talking about colonial architecture. I wanted to talk a little bit about music and how it relates to architecture. So, we had dinner like a week ago, and you were telling, and I was asking which styles of music do you not super prefer, and one you said was galant, and you also pretty much didn't care for any of the music that came from the era. And I know you're also not a huge fan of Mahler, right? So like late romantic. So what would be the corresponding architectural styles of like the galant and the romantic? And do you feel the same about those corresponding architectural styles, or does it just not work that way?
Well, sure. Yeah, I mean, style galant, meaning the musical style of the, would you say, mid to later 18th century. Um, you
After
know,
Bach, CPE
yeah,
Bach style,
yeah,
Mozart,
yeah,
Haydn,
yeah.
pretty,
Um,
sometimes beautiful, sometimes banal.
yeah, I mean, it corresponds to Rococo architecture and Rococo fashion in general. Um, yeah, I would say you can characterize Baroque art, be it music or arts and architecture. Baroque art is characterized by trying to be sort of as grand and impressive and as resolute as possible. It's got a big emotional quality, like Baroque art seeks to like really make you feel something and feel it intensely. Um, it has a it has an emotional confidence, a spiritual confidence that yeah, it never fails to impress, you might say. Um, and then, after doing that for like 100 years, artists got tired of that and said, well, let's try a new paradigm. Let's try making everything sort of light and cheerful, relaxing, simple, and that was style gallant. It's not surprising that came as a reaction to high Baroque, because nobody can keep doing the same thing forever. But yeah, so you have composers like C.P. Bach, whose music is light and sweet. It does not make you think of cataclysmic conflicts between good and evil the way Bach's church music does. It
Mm-hmm.
sort of makes you think of foppish aristocrats at a dinner party, prancing around in high-heeled shoes and, fanning themselves, which was, of course, the kind of high society paradigm in the mid-18th century. Um, and yeah, Rococo is the visual arts correspondence to that, where ornamentation is all sort of feathers and ostrich plumes and,
Hmm.
stuff that's like asymmetrical and delicate to the extreme, and it's all pretty. I mean, a Rococo interior is super pretty, but nobody would ever say it's like edifying or spiritually moving. It's at a very light and earthly level. Um,
And is it the same with architecture at the time, or is it just architectural ornamentation? Because like Gothic versus
yeah,
Baroque is super different architecturally, not just in ornamentation, but in
yeah.
structure. Is there structural difference between Baroque and Rococo?
Yes. I mean, Rococo buildings got brighter. There's certainly some like monastery churches in Bavaria that are very much Rococo architecture. These big interiors from like the 1760s, where the churches are flooded with light, a lot of big clear glass windows, um, and checkerboard floors, and the church kind of feels like a sort of fairy tale ballroom, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you picture like if you picture the Beauty and the Beast movies, both the cartoon and the live action movie that Disney made,
Right.
the Beast's palace castle is very much presented as Rococo architecture. Um,
Okay. But like
it's
St. Michael's would be more Baroque. I mean, it's really Georgian architecture, right?
yeah, it's English Baroque or
But it has
Georgian
tons
English
and
era.
tons of light. So what would make it? Maybe this is a dumb question. I don't know, but what would make it more Rococo and less Baroque? Because you would classify it more Baroque, right?
That question does not apply well to American architecture. Um,
Oh, okay.
the distinction between high Baroque and Rococo is really a distinction among continental European art, um, Catholic art.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, in England and even more so in America, Baroque never achieved its full expression of sort of theatricality and ornamentation. Baroque was much more rational and toned down in England than it was in France, Germany, or Italy, and America being quite austere and puritanical in its philosophy in the 18th century, even more so. So
Okay.
American Baroque architecture, like St. Michael's, is very austere compared to Italian or German architecture of the same period. So yeah, I would say in America, you cannot even distinguish Baroque and Rococo in architecture. Um,
Okay. Yeah, that's super
in
insightful.
in
Maybe not for other people, but for me,
yeah,
that's super insightful because I've wondered about that a
yeah,
lot.
yeah. In furniture making, sometimes you can. There is you sometimes will see like a gilded picture frame or a gilded wall mirror that was American made in the 18th century that is all out Rococo. But that's because it was commissioned by some lady who went back and forth between New York and Paris and wanted something in what she would have called the Parisian style. It wasn't really Rococo was never really a movement in America.
Now, what about Mahler? So, like, what architecture would correspond with Mahler?
Um, well, I mean,
I know that's kind of a abstract question, but
well, it's a difficult question because he's late 19th century, yes. So in that period, there's not really any one architectural style anymore. The last time that there was a prevailing style was the early 19th century with like Greek revival, neoclassicism.
mm-hmm.
But once you're like into the 1840s and beyond, architecture becomes eclectic. Different architects are building different buildings in totally different styles, and generally it's revivals. Somebody will build a Baroque revival opera house, but at the same time he'll build a Gothic revival church and a Romanesque revival synagogue. And collegiate Gothic is favored for college campuses, but sort of Greco-Roman neoclassicism is favored for government buildings. Um,
So
yeah,
maybe there's not like one general trend style, but
well,
like for example,
it's the same with music. Brahms wrote in a different style from everybody else in the 19th century.
well, I mean, he's like the late Beethoven,
Yeah,
you know.
or Mendelssohn had an interest in Baroque revival. And then you get into early 20th century composers, like Dörfler, who was sort of medieval revival, trying to make his music sound kind of Gothic.
Right. I Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, for me, like for an example, like Gaudi is Messiaen. Now maybe
Yeah.
that's crazy. Maybe that's just to me, but to me, it's like the playing around with light
Hmm.
and color and the just playfulness.
Yeah,
It's like the way that Gaudi sort of plays with like the structures of tree trunks. Kind of seems like Messiaen playing with bird song.
for
It's
sure.
do
Yeah.
you see the
Well,
same parallel?
yes, I do. Well, and more so because they're both rooted in the Gothic aesthetic. Um,
Oh, okay.
Gaudi's Sagrada Familia is loosely Gothic in style, but ornamented in his own very personal way. Um, and to me, Messiaen expresses a Gothic aesthetic. I mean, I can really only picture Messiaen in a Gothic cathedral. If I'm picturing a visual analog to it, it's definitely not Baroque or neoclassical or Romantic. Um,
Interesting. Now, have you been to
um,
La Trinité in Paris, where he was as organist?
no,
It's really interesting. It's sort of I'm gonna say this, and then I'm sure I'm gonna be lambasted if someone's gonna say it's not Romanesque, but it's like way more Romanesque. And there's all of these really Byzantine-looking iconography.
hmm
I think it's classified as like Neo-Byzantine,
sure,
which is really interesting to me. It's like I walked into La Trinité. I'm like, oh, that almost looks like an Orthodox iconostasis.
yeah.
And so, I mean, I don't know. I don't really get that vibe from his music. It's sort of the same. Like I think of it more as Gothic, but I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's when you're talking about sort of perceived analogs between music and visual arts, all you can really do is assert them. You can't prove them. It's like it's obvious that listening to Messiaen's organ music is just like looking at sort of the light raking through a stained glass window in a Gothic church. It's like it's obvious those two. There's some parallel between those two. I mean, I don't know why. You can't prove it, but anybody would see it.
Right. Now, we had a conversation not that long ago where I had just told you that I'd read in preparing for doctoral exams Willie Appel's The History of Keyboard Music, and at some certain point he makes a little off comment about how this so-and-so's music is atavistic and is actually could be classified more as Gothic than Baroque, much like J.S. Bach. And I thought, wow, that's a crazy comment that Bach could be considered more Gothic than Baroque. And you had some interesting thoughts about that.
Yeah. Well, I don't really agree with that statement, though I can understand where it's coming from. I would say the way in which that might make some sense is that Bach was basically a liturgical composer. He wrote music for church, and even when he wrote sort of music for concerts, like his Mass in B minor, it's still ostensibly music for church, even though it would normally be performed in a concert. And everything he wrote has a spiritual ethos to it.
Mm-hmm.
So, as such, he was not really a man of his time, because in his time, first half of the 18th century, the zeitgeist was not very focused on liturgical art or on church stuff. And the other famous Baroque composers were really secular, Handel, Vivaldi, these are the people who rivaled Bach in fame. I'm sure
they wrote chamber music.
Yeah, I'm sure Handel and Vivaldi occasionally wrote something for church, but basically you think of
Well, you
Handel
got the
and
Messiah
Vivaldi.
in there. You gotta definitely include the Messiah.
And even the Messiah, it's like, even though the Messiah is a biblical text, it's not liturgical music. It's not for performing during a church service, and its overall style feels really operatic. It does not have the ethos of liturgical music the way Bach does. Because by ethos of liturgical music, I mean liturgical music needs to have a certain sort of steadiness to it, that it's not going to suddenly distract you with an explosion of dramatic noise. It's not going to bewilder you with long, super quiet parts you can barely hear. And it's not going to be really show-offy, with some virtuoso soloist out there making a spectacle of himself.
But the Messiah is that.
Yeah, because it's operatic in style. Opera does all of those things because it's meant to entertain and amaze.
Man, every time I listen to the Messiah, I think this might be the greatest piece of Western music ever written.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is fantastic. Even though everyone agrees Bach is the greatest composer of all time, the Messiah might be the greatest piece. I don't know. Those are pretty bold statements, but
Sure. Yeah. But in any event, the point is, famous composers of Bach's era were famous because they wrote opera and because they wrote chamber music. And the more dramatically entertaining their music was, the more it was valued, because that was the zeitgeist at the time. It was a theatrical secular age, the early 18th century. So in many ways, Bach was simply not a man of his time. He seems like a composer of the time of Palestrina, the 16th century, when composers were really fixated on church music, or even a man of the Middle Ages, when everything about society was focused on the church and the liturgical arts. So in that sense, you might argue, Bach was a man born in the wrong century. He should have been of the Middle Ages. But that's kind of a glib thing to say. On the other hand...
But didn't you say there was something about his, the architecture and the sound of counterpoint and
Yes.
his being able to. You explained it to me. I cannot explain it as well as you explained it to me, but something
Well, sure.
about the stained glasses will, in a Gothic cathedral can sort of mute some of the.
Yeah. Well,
Speak to.
just speaking of acoustics in churches, big Gothic churches have an acoustic quality where they are highly reverberant in the high pitches and not so reverberant in the low pitches, and that's because the huge areas of leaded glass, the giant stained glass windows, they will reflect a high frequency, but they absorb a low frequency because they shake a little bit.
This is in Gothic churches.
Yes. Well, it's true of glass in general, but it's especially true of Gothic churches because they have so much glass. And particularly the glass in Gothic churches is very thin glass held together with leading, which is flimsy, and a loud low-pitched sound actually shakes those windows. Like if you hit a pedal note on the organ and you walk over to a stained glass window and put your finger on it, you'll feel the glass shaking. And by shaking, it absorbs energy out of the sound and deadens those deep notes. And so the acoustic signature in a big Gothic church it's such that the low pitches die out before the high pitches, and you can easily perceive this if you go into St. Bavo's Church in the Netherlands, which not only has acres of glass, it also has paneled wooden ceilings, wood vaulting, which does the same thing. It also has that effect of being a panel absorber. You go in St. Bavo's Church and you play a giant chord on the organ and then release. The bass note will disappear almost instantly, and then the really, really high sparkly notes from the mixtures just linger and linger and linger and linger and linger.
Interesting.
And that's really important for Bach's organ music because he's got a fast-moving pedal line, and if you play Bach in like a marble-paneled, neoclassical church that doesn't have all that glass and wood, it gets muddy. If you've ever heard Bach played at like Girard College in Philadelphia, which has like the most reverberation of any church across all frequencies, Bach sounds terrible in there.
Because there's not the clarity of sound.
Yeah, the music is continually modulating. Every time he changes a pedal note, it's a new chord, but all those different chords are just on top of each other, and it just sounds like a lot of mud. There exists music that's optimized for that kind of acoustic music that doesn't modulate very fast.
And the Baroque architecture, you said, is more like Orthodox in that it's relatively the same across the sound spectrum?
Yeah, so, Russian Orthodox music, or Byzantine chant for that matter, they like to have a lot of bass reverberation because Orthodox churches are fully plastered inside and have tiny little windows and not much wood. They are reverberant equally across a lot of frequencies, and as a result, Orthodox liturgical music does not modulate very much. Like Byzantine chant will linger on a single eson for a long, long time before moving to a different eson. And Russian Orthodox music, even 19th century Russian Orthodox music, it just doesn't modulate very much. It'll sit on a chord, and the high notes will be moving all over the place on top of that chord, but that chord will last a long time before it shifts to the next chord. And that makes it work well in those very reverberant Russian churches, because this basically the music is designed to sound muddy. It's designed to all blend together, and that works as long as you don't modulate too often.
So, that makes sense.
Yeah, any choir has had the experience that like they're assigned to sing a Bach piece, and then they go into some 19th century Catholic church that's all marble paneled, and they try to sing it, and it sounds muddy. It doesn't sound very good because there's too much reverberation across all the frequencies. Now,
And the Byzantine architecture is similar, right?
yeah, yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is.
I mean, not
Yeah.
Byzantine. The like old German Baroque is
Yes.
similar to the Byzantine,
Yes.
with lots of plaster.
Yeah, lots of plaster, not much windows. Yeah. Now, Bach's church was not very big, and it had a lot of wood in it. I was actually pretty surprised when I saw the pictures of the church where Bach did most of his composing. It's not a huge church. It's not a very
Well,
grand
which church? Are you
church.
talking Thomaskirche?
Um, well, it's
Because that's
all
where he was
painted-
the longest. And
Yeah, I think
I
that's
mean,
the
I wouldn't
one.
say it's huge, but it's hard to know now too, because the architecture is totally different than it was when Bach was there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but just keep in mind that these German churches, they weren't huge. They weren't as big as Gothic cathedrals, and they were probably full of people, which means that deadened the acoustic considerably when they were being used. And so, yeah, that made Bach's music work in them. But of course, he also played in some of the Gothic churches, and his music works fantastically in those Gothic churches, so long as the bass reverberation isn't too lengthy. So
Right.
that's a way you could argue that his music is more optimized to a Gothic aesthetic, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I guess there's something about Gothic I mean, it's centered around the church, but it's also serious, you
Yes.
know. And there's some sort of gaiety about the Baroque that you just don't really get in Bach as much. Not
There
that he's
can-
not that he never
yes.
has levity, but it's just not the same as frivolity
That is true. Although I have to say, Baroque architecture can have that frivolity and levity, and it certainly does as you get into the Rococo. But my favorite Baroque architecture is the Baroque architecture that's kind of dark and serious. And there's a lot of Baroque architecture like that also. Yeah, and in my travels, I'm always seeking out Baroque buildings that are kind of dark and frightening. Even
yeah.
that's what I really love. You find a lot of that in Spain, by the way. To this day, the Spanish Catholic Church kind of cultivates a somewhat dark and spooky Baroque aesthetic that I really enjoy.
Sure. Have you designed many Western churches? I mean, I know you mostly do Orthodox churches, but have you done any Western? And if there was to be, we've talked a little about this, a legit Western Rite, what should the architecture look like? I guess that's two questions.
That's a huge question. I mean, I have done some work on Western churches. There's a Catholic church in Greenville, Our Lady of the Rosary, that's in a sort of early medieval Italian basilica style that I did a lot of the conceptual design on that building. Yeah, the Western Rite is a difficult question. Well, I love the Western Rite. I was Anglo-Catholic for a long time before I converted to Orthodoxy, and when I'm traveling in England, I'll definitely go to evensong services in the beautiful churches. If I'm in New York City, I'll go to evensong at St. Thomas Fifth Avenue because I still adore the aesthetics of the Western Rite when it's really well done. But it is uneasy to reconcile it with Eastern Orthodoxy, I have to say.
Really? How so?
Well, in the Western Rite, there's a sense that sort of everybody's looking the same direction, and that everybody's looking at the priest who's mediating with God, and everybody's looking at the crucifix, the altar cross or the rood, where Christ, in his posture of crucifixion, is mediating with God, and there's this very sense that the movement is forward to the altar, priest and crucifix, and then upward to God, who's up there above the church. And so a Western church, it has those two axes. It's forward and it's up. And even in the wording of the prayers, like every prayer in the Western church ends through Jesus Christ our Lord. Jesus Christ is mediating every intercession. It goes to the crucifix. By his action of being dead on the cross, he reconciles us to God, and thus, through Jesus Christ our Lord on the cross, up the prayer goes to God, who's not in our space, he's up above our space. That's totally different from an Orthodox liturgy. In an Orthodox liturgy, the idea is that the inside of the church is an icon of the kingdom of heaven. Heaven is there. You're standing in the middle of it. And Christ is God in Orthodoxy.
Well, he is in the West, too. I mean...
But but the emphasis, the way Christ is pictured and addressed liturgically, is that he is God, meaning we simply address our prayers to God while looking at an icon of Christ. Like, liturgically speaking, we don't, in practice, make a distinction between God the Son and God the Father in our liturgical actions in Orthodoxy. And although we have icons of Christ crucified, they're kind of specific to being used on Good Friday. You know, on Good Friday we'll bring out the Golgotha cross with Christ crucified because we're commemorating the event of the crucifixion on Good Friday. But generally
and he's
speaking,
usually alive on the cross, right?
Yes.
Like I think
yes.
it's what the Gira crucifix in Cologne from like 1060 or something. That's the first depiction of Christ actually dead on the cross.
Yes. Yeah,
okay.
That is true. That is true, because if we're using an icon of Christ on the cross, we're using that icon the same way we would use any other icon, which is sort of communing with the figure, which you can't do if he's dead. So yeah, our icons of the crucifixion show him pre-deceased, as it were. But in general, in Orthodoxy, images of the crucifixion are simply part of the cycle of feasts. You know, you'll have a cycle of biblical feasts, and the crucifix will be just one among them. It's not a prominent image in Orthodoxy, whereas our main image of Christ is Christ Pantocrator. That's the one that we paint up at the top of the dome, and it's also the main icon on the iconostas, and the main icon you kiss when you come into church is Christ Pantocrator. And that's basically showing Christ as God. You know, that's Christ enthroned as God, judging the universe, in charge of everything. Pantocrator is like autocrat, you know, pancrat. It's pancrat means, you know, in charge of all.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's basically the image of the God of the universe, but it's an image of Christ. So again, liturgically, we're not really making any distinction between God the Father and God the Son. We don't even paint God the Father as a canonical rule in Orthodoxy, because
except those couple of times that you do, and because you're Greek and you live in Charleston.
Well, there was a time when it was fashionable to imitate Roman Catholic art by painting the God the Father separately, but that was a period of time that the Orthodox Church has kind of repented of and gone back to our tradition, which is that if you've seen the Son, you've seen the Father, because the Father is not visible bodily. No one has actually seen him except by seeing the Son. And anyway, so the liturgical experience of an Orthodox service is that heaven is all around you. You know, the second, it's basically like the second coming has already happened, New Jerusalem has already descended, here's all of the resurrected saints painted in their bodily form all around you. The singing of the choir is mingled with the singing of the angels. There's no distinction between the two. And that's just a completely different relationship to God than the Western liturgy. The Western liturgy is very much grounded on the earth. It's like, we're still down here, God's still up there, and we can only even talk to God because there occurred Christ's death on the crucifix, and that's why that's the central image that everybody's looking at when they pray, and everything is sort of mediated through that moment of Christ's death.
I mean, I don't want to totally minimize the differences. I know, of course, there's differences, but it doesn't strike me that those are mutually irreconcilable differences.
Yeah.
Like, it seems to me like Orthodox Christian belief as such could, like, easily subsume within the umbrella of Orthodox Christian belief both approaches to God, and both like architectural approaches.
I agree. I don't wish to say that one of these is right or wrong, or that even one is better or worse, because I don't believe that. I think they are both equally valid and traditional expressions of man's relationship to God. And of course, with regards to dogma, there's not really a difference between the Eastern Church and the Western Church on these basic things. There's definitely a difference in emphasis with regards to the crucifixion. For sure, the Western Church emphasizes atonement for sins on the cross more than the Eastern Church. But these are differences of style and emphasis. They're not fundamental dogmatic disagreements.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, those different liturgical expressions are an enormous difference, because again, like the Orthodoxy, it's all about we're already in heaven, and so we're going to make our church look like an icon of heaven. We're going to, here we are in the New Jerusalem with all the saints around us. They're here in our space. We're going to pray communing as equals to the icons. We're not even going to kneel when we pray. Like in Orthodoxy, you stand up when you pray because you're pretending that you're a saint. You're pretending that you're on equal footing with the saints that you're praying to in the icons, and even on an equal footing with God. You're pretending that you've already gone through theosis and are standing there in the kingdom of heaven as a saint among the other saints. Whereas in the Western
but there's
Church,
prostrations and stuff. I mean, y'all prostrate all the time.
Yeah.
And you kneel during the great canon of St. Andrew the Crete? There's a little kneeling.
If it's Lent and you're saying penitential prayers, sure, then you take on the posture of penitence. But again, that's the exception. It's not the rule of Orthodox worship. But in a Western church, I would say kneeling is sort of the rule. Like, if you go
it's funny because you'd think if you were ruling and reigning with God, then you'd have some chairs in there so everybody could sit down.
Yeah, well, it's sort of the old Greek philosopher posture that, like, the bishop sits down in his throne and everybody else stands, because, like, that's how it would have been in an ancient Greek school. Like, the master, Socrates, Plato, he would sit down and all the students would stand and listen to him. That's kind of the posture that's expressed in an Orthodox service for historical reasons.
I just know I've taken some people to a service, like, what'd you think? And they're like, God, there's a lot of standing.
Yeah, there is a lot of standing.
I'm like, yeah, but the service. And they're like, I couldn't think about the service. It's just a lot of standing. And I'm like, come on.
You shouldn't make too much of it, because in the old days there was a lot of standing in general. It's like chairs were actually relatively uncommon furniture in general in the old days. Basically people stood a whole lot or they sat on the floor, and, historically speaking. And for sure, if there's some important meeting, like it's a diplomatic embassy and like ambassadors are talking to each other, they're absolutely standing. And that's the idea that when we're walking into heaven and we're face to face with an icon in prayer, there's like a diplomatic relationship between heaven and earth going on there, and you're going to stand for that because it's important.
Yeah. Sure, fair enough. But then the question then is coming back from our tangent. Then the question is like, okay, well, if you're gonna do Western Rite architecture, which isn't really a thing, because Western Rite Orthodox is a thing, and like there's like 11 of them or something like that, and they're all really tiny. But if it was a thing,
Yeah.
then
Well,
would you embrace the different approach that is sort of Gothic and Western architecture and that sort of different paradigm, or would you try to incorporate the Byzantine paradigm into new Western architecture?
Yeah. Well, before I answer that, consider the flip side with Gothic architecture. Just as Orthodox architecture is extremely heavenly, Gothic architecture is really earthy. Like, it looks like tree trunks. It's all full of, gargoyles and, sort of grotesque carvings that represent very earthy things. The materiality of Gothic architecture is at its best when it's earthy, when it's all sort of gray stone and earthy gray slabs and tombstones on the floor. And it's like the most heavenly thing about Gothic architecture, the stained glass windows, are literally marginal. They put the images of saints and they put all that beautiful color at the interface between the church and the outdoors. So it's like you can sort of perceive heaven from within the church when you look at the stained glass windows with all the saints and all of the beautiful color. But that stuff's not exactly in church with you. It's at the margin of your perception, just on the outside edge of your space. So again, it's all basically expressing like we're still on earth. There's heaven right there. There's the crucifix that makes it accessible to us, but we're not there yet. Someday we'll be up there above the ceiling, where it's all beautiful light, but we're not there yet. So, to my sense, a Western liturgy feels best in a very earthy Gothic church, where you can actually really get a sense of the weight of the stone, the earthiness of the stone and the timber and the tile and so forth. But when you take like a Gothic church like that that's very earthy, and you start filling it with frescoes that are, or even statues that are like putting heavenly stuff in your space, it kind of undermines that expression. You feel this a lot in Italy, because in Italy there are Gothic churches that are all painted with iconographic frescoes.
Well, and I think even in the Freiburg Cathedral, like there's the vestiges of what used to be the paint there.
Yeah.
But I think it used to be everything was frescoed.
There was absolutely a transitional period where, sort of at the interface between Romanesque and Gothic, when it was pretty common for Gothic churches to have fresco schemes. And that was especially true in places like Spain and Italy that were kind of remote from the origins of Gothic, because Gothic is a French style, and the French did not paint frescoes in those Gothic cathedrals. Absolutely, the first Gothic church, which was Saint-Denis in Paris, when Abbot Suger started building that church in the 1140s, as literally the first Gothic-style building, as art historians categorize it, that absolutely was not frescoed. The only imagery was in the stained glass.
Was the outside of it in color? Because I know that was another thing, right? Where like, especially a lot of the English Gothic cathedrals, like the outside would totally be painted as well.
Yeah. When I say there were no frescoes, I mean there were no iconographic figures painted on the walls. I don't mean that there wasn't any color. Definitely medieval Gothic churches would, sometimes they were totally lime-washed and kind of bright inside. Sometimes they just picked out like certain details in the architectural moldings with color. But interestingly, over the course of the Gothic period, they did less and less of that. So as you get to the really beautiful late Gothic buildings, like the English Perpendicular style in the 15th century, they didn't paint anything on that stone. Like the very end of Gothic, like King's College, Cambridge, that was absolutely never painted. It was bare stone, as it is now, and you couldn't imagine it any other way. Like, it would be imagining King's College, Cambridge with like paint and polychrome on that stone. No, you would not want that.
Yeah, that'd be a little weird.
The stone the stone is so beautifully sculpted, it offers you all the beauty you could possibly want, and the color is in the stained glass where it properly belongs in that manner of architecture.
Okay.
So yeah, I think so. Yeah, you can go to Italy and you can see a Gothic church, like in Assisi, for instance. Assisi is a classic example of a Gothic cathedral that's totally frescoed with iconographic schemes. But it's like, I don't love that church. I mean, I don't think it's as successful as a totally Gothic building in France or England that's grey stone and stained glass. And I don't think it's as successful as a purely Byzantine church, that's all domes and barrel vaults, where the iconographic scheme can kind of flow smoothly from one surface to another and represent the sort of full surround and embrace of heaven, the way a Byzantine church does. I find those sort of in-between hybrids that have one foot in the Byzantine tradition and one foot in the Gothic fashion to be a compromise of both. That's not to say they're not beautiful buildings. It's just I don't think they're the pinnacle of stylistic expression. So then,
if the West is like, this is where man is, and then the Orthodox is like, this is where God is. Like you said, they're not mutually irreconcilable. They're just two different perspectives on, from two different vantage points.
Yes, they are. Say. They're both right. They're both totally legitimate expressions of Christian doctrine. I'm just skeptical of attempts to mix the two together.
So then, what would Western Rite? So like, you're in charge of doing Western Rite Orthodox architecture, and you don't like the idea of the compromise between the two. Do you invent a totally new style of architecture, or because you have Western liturgies, do you just go with the vantage point from the West and try to build in a neo-Gothic style or a neo-Romanesque?
Yeah, I would try to keep the liturgical experience consistently Western. I probably would not choose Gothic.
Maybe Romanesque?
Yes, I would probably prefer to choose Romanesque because at least people perceive it as kind of ancient, and it maybe has more universality to it. Like there's no such thing as like internationally Gothic looking. You're gonna look English Gothic or French Gothic or something.
What is Ralph Adams Cram, for example?
Well, he did both, but most of his buildings are English Gothic in style. But he did
English Gothic.
His design for the nave of St. John the Divine in New York is very totally French Gothic in style.
Interesting. Are you a big Ralph Adams Cram fan?
Oh yeah. Every one of his buildings is a masterpiece. But he could design in any style, and he sometimes blended the two. Like his chapel at Princeton University is a mixture of French and English Gothic.
There was a church up in Pittsburgh that I saw like last summer, which is a Ralph Adams Cram, big-looking cathedral building. There was a tree growing out of one of the windows on the outside. It's just totally... It's totally been left to whatever, and it's like almost destroyed. It doesn't seem like any plans of restoring it. It's just tragic and heartbreaking. I mean, it's such a beautiful building.
Yeah, wouldn't it be fantastic if the sort of revival of church-going that's happening in the South could, if people could move back up north and, restore all the splendid church buildings of the north.
Restore some Ralph Adams Cram. That would be great.
Well, it's all over the Rust Belt that most churches are abandoned and deteriorating, which is a tragedy because so many of them are incredibly glorious churches that we simply don't have the skills or the budget to replicate nowadays. It's a tragedy. I wish America had like a ministry of culture that would like take disused churches under state protection the way they do in Europe. But that's a political discussion. But yeah, Yeah,
But you would
Western
do
Rite.
Romanesque. Back to that.
Western.
You would probably do Romanesque.
I might do Romanesque. I also might do Jacobean English style. That the English architecture of the early 17th century.
Interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, it's where it's where American church architecture started, or at least Anglo-American church architecture started. Like the oldest Anglo-American church is St. Luke's Church in Virginia, which is in a Jacobean style, and it's got some Gothic influence. It's got some Baroque influence. I mean, basically, Jacobean is like a mixture of late Gothic and early Baroque. Those two sensibilities mixed together. And there's some very, very beautiful churches in England that have that aesthetic. It tends to be kind of domestic, like that was not a period of grand church building. It was kind of a period of village church construction. Yeah, and those Jacobean churches, they tend to have kind of low barrel vaulted ceilings, a lot of wood paneling, a lot of beautiful wood carving. It's like if you picture, the hobbits from the Lord of the Rings going to church, like if you picture a church version of Bag End, Bilbo
that would be
Baggins'
Western
house,
Rite Orthodox.
that would be Jacobean church style.
Okay.
Everything's sort of wood paneled and kind of low and rounded and kind of cheerful but kind of serious at the same time.
That'd be cool.
I'm very fond of that style, and I think that I think that could be a good fit for American church building nowadays.
Do you think the Orthodox will, or pockets of the Orthodox will just slowly shift into some sort of Westerny Orthodox, or not really? Because it seems like every Orthodox priest I've ever talked to hates Western Rite, unless they're Western Rite. And, but there are a bunch of disaffected Catholics and Anglicans who would love to have communion with the Orthodox and, would love to be super high church. And
well, I have to answer that question from two sides. There's the question of to what extent should Eastern Rite Orthodox churches in the West Westernize, and then there's the question of to what extent should the Orthodox Church promote Western Rite Orthodoxy as a separate thing from Eastern Rite Orthodoxy. Those two questions have very different answers.
So with the first, how Westernized, like Appalachian Orthodox music
yes,
that's the new fad.
I am a big proponent of adopting Western or just local influences into Orthodoxy to the extent that they are artistically and culturally harmonious with what we do in an Eastern Rite Orthodox church. So my own architecture draws very heavily from local influences. If I design a church in the Southwest or in Florida, I'm going to bring in some sort of Spanish mission influences. If I design it in New England, I'm going to bring in some New England colonial influences. And, like Holy Cross Monastery that I've got under construction in Appalachia, we all agreed we really want to do timber frame roofs and timber frame porches because people think of timber framing as being an Appalachian expression in architecture. And even in general, like Americans really like wood. So I have found a consensus pretty much all across the country that people are okay with me doing timber frame roofs on a masonry church. Because even though that's unusual in Orthodoxy, it's not unheard of in Orthodox tradition. Certainly some of the early basilica churches of Orthodoxy, like Holy Nativity in Bethlehem or St. Demetrios in Thessalonica, these these are famous Orthodox churches that have timber truss ceilings, so it's in Orthodoxy. It kind of got phased out of Orthodoxy when they started doing everything with arches and domes. But it's a way that we can make Orthodox churches look more American, and because Americans love wood, Americans love timber framing, it reminds us of much about our sort of heritage as frontiersmen and barn builders, I suppose. And I found that everybody likes that idea. I even show Greeks this, and Greeks say, that's beautiful, it makes us look American. As long as we still have a dome, we're cool with it.
Okay.
So yeah, I think there is, and there's much that's beautiful in American artistic heritage. Old American furniture is some of the best furniture in the world. Like really good 18th century American furniture. It's better quality than English furniture of the same period. And worldwide American furniture makers, and particularly American shipbuilders, were considered the best carpenters in the world. Like, even the French Navy bought American-made ships
Wow.
in the 18th century. Yeah. And we built the best ships in the world. Like, you probably remember the story from the War of 1812, where the British Navy attacked the USS Constitution, and the cannonballs bounced off the sides because the British nicknamed the ship Old Ironsides because they thought it must be an ironclad ship.
Wow.
But it was a wooden ship, and the cannonballs bounced off the sides because the carpenters had built it better than any English ship.
Dang.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Massachusetts, where the USS Constitution is still there in Boston Harbor, and that's like one of the major stories children are told in school of, like, that's why we were so much better than the English and won the war. But anyway, but that is true. That is true that in the 18th and early 19th centuries, American furniture and shipbuilding was considered the best in the world. And so our sort of idea that, like, making stuff out of wood and doing it really well is somehow especially American, that's a legitimate idea, and I promote that in my work. And and Americans did beautiful embroidery in the old days. We had beautiful fabrics, and our architecture was great. I mean, in a way, historic American architecture is a better model for modern American church building than old world European architecture, just because it's simpler. It's like, we didn't build Gothic and Baroque cathedrals in the old days here. We built simple country churches for the most part. And simple country churches is the model we need to look at, because, when a contemporary American parish, whether it's Anglican or Orthodox, either way, when a parish of nowadays sets out to build a church, it's like, we don't have a $50 million budget to build a Gothic or Baroque building. We've got, like, if we're lucky, we've got like a $2 million budget, which is going to build us a simple country church. So we're pretty lucky that we're a nation whose ecclesiastical heritage is simple country churches, because it means we can look back on our old buildings and see very good models for how to build beautiful churches on a modest budget. So, yeah, I'm always telling my Orthodox church clients just look at the simple country churches. I don't care if they're Baptist churches or what they are. If they're beautiful and they're old, they have some details that can inspire us. Obviously, if it's an Orthodox church, I'm going to design it to suit the Orthodox divine liturgy and to have frescoed walls and have all the things that the Eastern Rite demands. But I still would like it to feel like it is in some way in the tradition of the local church building that's been going on for centuries in that area.
No, that makes sense. Musically, what do you think musically? I mean, I know there's this big Appalachian Orthodox style chanting that people are writing in, but it does seem like nobody really wants to do, for example, like John Mason Neal took all these hymns of the ancient Eastern Church
Yeah.
and then paraphrase them and put them to tunes. But I don't know of any Orthodox church that ever does any of those, like, like sing some of the
Yeah.
St. John of Damascus text to Ellacombe or King's Lynn or whatever.
Well, yeah,
And
you're right.
but then also there's like Billings, for example. Like Billings has a great Easter anthem, Christ the Lord is risen today. And
Yeah.
granted, it has some weird lyrics in there about fountains and eternal youth and blah blah blah. But the beginning totally sounds like the Paschal Troparion. And so I just kind of wonder, it's like, how far could you take it? And then the question is, how far would people be willing to take it? Which may be a totally different question.
Yeah. Well, it's really a question of what the people in that church will accept as sounding like church music. I remember the Orthodox composer Benedict Sheehan, after years and years and years of struggling with this question of what is the boundaries of appropriate style in church music, eventually came to the conclusion that church music is whatever sounds like church music to the people who go to that church. That's what's appropriate church music.
Yeah.
Because different churches will have wildly different ideas of what's appropriate church music. But yeah, I think, these beautiful experiments with appellation sounding Orthodox church music, they work in that they kind of remind you of Byzantine chant, they kind of remind you of Georgian harmony, they kind of remind you of Znameni chant. Even though they're also sounding like Appalachian folk singing, they're also kind of reminding you of all of this stuff that you're used to in Orthodox heritage. And so they keep on the right side of the line of how people perceive and accept stuff. And yeah, so I think there's a lot of room for drawing from American styles of singing, American melodies, the sort of, William Billings' sort of, harmony, the shape note harmony is, yeah, there's a lot that's similar to, to sort of Orthodox folk traditions from Georgia and Bulgaria, with that kind of rough harmony with a lot of parallel fifths. Yeah, I think we can and should draw from that stuff. I think we should do it a lot more deliberately than we do, to be honest. I'll tell you a funny anecdote. Our choir director, Olivia Ramett, she was at St. Tikhon's Monastery years ago, and St. Tikhon's Monastery has been in business for like 110 years. I think they were founded in 1910, and she found a dusty old service book buried under, old stuff in that church that was printed in like 1930, and it's all in Slavonic, it's written in Cyrillic, but it was a music book, and it has a cherubic hymn in it, and the title of the cherubic hymn, written in Russian, is the cherubic hymn, "To the tone, nearer my God to thee." and that's totally what it is. It's the cherubic hymn. It's the cherubic hymn text, but it's nearer my God to thee. You sing it. It's in Russian, but it's like, we who mystically represent. It's the nearer my God to thee. American hymn melody to the cherubic hymn text. So in 1930, these Russians who didn't even speak English knew enough to take a local melody from the local church singing tradition of Pennsylvania.
I should totally revive that.
And use that.
Cherubic hymn text, the nearer my God to thee. That'd be great.
Yeah, they called it "To the tone, nearer my God to thee." So it's like the Russians were smart enough to do this in 1930, but we seem to be not smart enough to do it now. We're still bending over backwards to take these Russian melodies that were written for Russian words and trying to fit English texts to them. It's like, why are we doing this? We often have good Western melodies that fit singing in English very well, and that can be adapted to use in Orthodox churches.
Like, the Talus modes, right? Like, Talus had his own octo echo system.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. But on the other hand, no, I don't think you can just like literally take the Western hymnal and just start singing a Western hymn in the middle of an Orthodox service for stylistic reasons, because, we are not accustomed to singing metered and rhyming texts, and we're not accustomed to singing melodies that have such a square and prominent beat as most of the hymns in like a Protestant hymnal. So, we do sometimes actually sing these like at the end of the service paraliturgically. Like if it's Christmas season at our church, we absolutely sing Christmas carols at the end of the service just because people enjoy it. But they do musically feel like quite a substantial break from the character of everything else we sing in the service. They're just, they have such a beat to them and such a sort of strident, merry character that it's like, yeah, if we put that in the middle of the service, people would really say, like, whoa, that's really out of left field. That's a disruption. So,
yeah.
So
whereas,
yeah,
my friend Andrew Dittman, who did his Kyriel, which is all, like, 9 different Gregorian chant masses, a cappella, but set to the texts in English with 4-part harmony, seems like it wouldn't be an entirely disparate experience in an Orthodox church, or especially a Western Rite Orthodox church. It seems like that would be the thing that you would do, other than you'd have to drop the Filioque, because he's doing his text from the 1928 prayer book. But
I agree. And there's, and then there's any amount of like like 20th century English cathedral music, like anthems by, Herbert Howells, that you could insert into a Russian Orthodox service and nobody would notice, because it's so similar to 20th century, big Russian choral music in its style.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity to bring Western music into the Eastern Rite in a way that is stylistically sensitive and judicious and undistracting. But that's really what I would measure it against. I think baptizing local stuff into worship is an objective good, and we should do as much of that as we can. But
what about brutalist architecture?
It always has to be done in good taste, in a way that the people will accept. What's that?
Yes, I said, what about brutalist architecture? Should it be baptized into the Orthodox? Now, you did tell me that secretly every architect actually likes brutalism.
Yes.
Is this true?
Yeah. I mean, every architect, even classical ones, secretly like brutalism. And I have to be clear that by brutalism, we're talking about the very small number of buildings that are good examples of true brutalism. We're not talking about like run-of-the-mill 1960s crummy architecture. We're
not
talking
international modern.
Yeah, we're not talking about Soviet housing blocks in international style. We're talking about the sort of really crazy buildings that are properly classified as brutalism. Like a famous example is City Hall in Boston, or the Barbican in London. These buildings are fun and crazy, and you'll never forget them. And I don't promote architecture like this. I'm not saying we should build a lot of buildings like that.
Is Frank Lloyd Wright that, or Frank? No, what is Frank? Yeah, what is Frank Lloyd Wright?
Well,
that's just modern.
Well, he invented styles unto himself, and several of them. Like he invented prairie style, and he invented his sort of curvilinear late style, like the Guggenheim Museum, which many others have imitated. But totally different ideology. That's totally different from brutalism. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, well, you and I talked about, how brutalism is a sort of, it's sort of like, it was done by kind of architects who are accepting that post-war architecture was going to be cheap and mass-producible and use a lot of concrete, and they were kind of saying that, like, well, instead of just making totally boring block-shaped buildings, given that concrete is able to make pretty much any shape, why don't we make buildings in pretty much any shape? Why don't we make buildings in crazy experimental shapes that, are at least thought-provoking and have a certain element of sort of the post-apocalyptic sublime about them? Because there is a certain beauty in the sort of horrors of post-war concrete. It's a dark and frightening beauty, but it's a beauty nevertheless. So yeah, Brutalism was exploring all of these possibilities. There was a certain kind of apocalyptic optimism about it. We shouldn't be surprised that we like this in buildings to some extent, because we like this in movies. We see these disaster movies where the world is destroyed before our eyes in giant explosions and alien battles and everything, and we're like cheering it on, like, yeah, let's see more of this end of the world. I want to see more, beautiful destruction to intense classical music before my eyes. And
because even that type of stuff in classical music, like Boulez's Second Sonata, it's as wild as it gets, but there's something about it that I dig.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool. I mean, it's kind of horrific, and it's not. I would never do it in church, but
I once heard this genre of like apocalyptic destruction movies that are rendered with great artistic beauty. I once heard these movies characterized as liturgies for the end of the world. And I think there's something to that. We do have a strange innate longing for the end of the world. We love these kinds of end time stories, and it's always been there. I mean, there's lots of beautiful old paintings in art museums that show like the plagues of Egypt and civilization being, hit with lightning bolts and overrun with barbarians in a dark and stormy night. It's like that sublime beauty of the end of everything has always touched us in our hearts in some place. And maybe it's because we do sort of have a longing for, Armageddon, knowing that the New Jerusalem comes next, and that is ultimately, that is ultimately how evil is defeated, is with the end of the world.
Well, and there's something about beauty that incorporates the horror.
Yes.
Like that is the cross, like that is the sacrifice.
Absolutely.
There's something about something horrific. And so I hate horror movies generally.
Mm-hmm.
But every now and then, or even the suspense movies, like a Silent Place or A Quiet Place, I think is what it is. Like amazing movie.
Yes.
Or what's the one where Red Rum with what's his name? The Shining.
Oh yeah.
The Shining is amazing. It's like, to me, that's peak art. That's like the peak cinematography. There's something beautiful about The Shining.
Yes.
Even when the elevators open up and it's just like floods of blood coming out, which evidently took 2 months to film and almost bankrupted the whole project, because they would shoot it again and he'd say, doesn't look like blood, and so they do it again the next day. And
wow.
Like, doesn't look like blood, and I think they did it some 38 times before he finally said it looked like blood. And so, anyway, but same thing. You're saying there's an innate yearning for horror and for destruction because it kind of shows something.
Yeah, it's a strange thing about people that as soon as we get comfortable, we start looking to get into some trouble and be less comfortable. Like I remember Jordan Peterson talking about this. That he said that like this idea that modern sort of liberal governments have, that everybody seeks comfort, that like if only we could like get everybody in the world, enough food and enough electricity and a nice house, then everybody would be happy. But it's like, that's totally not true. That, like, if you picture yourself, like, being pampered, where, like, you lie down on a velvet sofa and somebody, feeds you grapes and chocolates, it's like, yeah, that might be nice for like half an hour, and then you'd be bored stiff and you'd want to get up and go find some adventure that's going to be uncomfortable and exciting.
It's the Dostoevsky thing. If you're left there in your devices in peace, you just start destroying stuff.
Yeah, so it's like, I mean, honestly, we see this with the election of Donald Trump. I mean, I don't want to pass judgment on Donald Trump, but there's obviously a narrative here that, like, civilization had been just going along pretty successful and pretty comfortable to the point that people are getting bored with it, and we'd kind of rather see somebody who's just going to kind of break things and stir things up, having no idea where that's going to lead us. Well, that's what people are like.
Not to get too political, but not to get too political, but I feel like in 2016, the hardcore MAGA Republicans, they were like, "I'm sick of the status quo. I want to destroy, like, let's just destroy it," And it's sort of on the left and the right. There's that impulse.
Yes,
I think in 2024 it was a little bit of, God, the last 4 years were lame. Can we please have something different than whatever this was? Which I just don't feel like it's the same destructive impulse as 2016. But it's a whole bunch of different forces. I mean, it's kind of hard for a presidential candidate to be shot in the head and then, not run away, and for a bunch of people to not think that that's bravery. I mean, love him or hate him, if Biden was shot in the ear and did the same thing, Biden would have probably won the election.
Yeah, maybe. Well, I don't want to have a political discussion besides that political things sometimes illustrate something about human nature. And if you see too many, rom-coms, you're going to really be itching to go see an end of the world movie. Because you just have so much tolerance for everything being nicey-nice before you want to see some trouble.
Dude, I listen to the War of the Worlds soundtrack while I'm working out quite a bit. The John Williams music for War of the Worlds. It's amazing. It's the best workout music ever. It just makes you angry and suspenseful and focused. And it's like, there's some utility to it. But maybe you wouldn't do Orthodox brutalist architecture.
Well, it's not a church style, is the thing. I'm always telling people, you got to judge art according to the purpose for which the art was created, and so you don't want to look at a non-church building and say that wouldn't make a good church. I mean, obviously it wasn't meant to make a good church, and the same is true of styles. I mean, I would not design a high Baroque Orthodox church. I sometimes have a little bit of Baroque influence in my church designs. Like if it's a church in New Mexico, I want it to have a little bit of a Spanish Baroque parapet going on because that's what makes it look like it belongs in New Mexico. But I'm not going to use the Baroque style broadly in an Orthodox church because it's not a good style for that purpose. But
now in Gaudi,
a Catholic church, sure, why not? Why not build a Baroque Catholic church? It's optimized for that purpose.
Now in Gaudi, right, the different facades of the church, and then there's one that looks like everything looks like bone. I forget what the facade is called.
That's a bit brutalist. I agree.
Right. How do you feel about that? Is that
it's terrible? Yeah. I mean. It's terrible.
And knowing that there's some horror in beauty, right? Because there's like something about there's horror in the sacred, right? The sacred has something about the cross, for example. Is there how far can you take it? Like, can something in the altar show that horror, or is it just automatically there, or it's different in different contexts? I mean, it's obviously different in different contexts.
Yeah, of course.
But how far would you take it?
Well, there's certainly room for depicting horrors in church. I mean, lots of Catholic churches have some pretty brutal paintings in them. You know,
Or some
all kinds of beheadings and martyrdoms.
Incorrupt bodies that are
Yes.
that are pretty corrupt looking.
Yeah, in Mexico or Bohemia, yeah, you see some pretty bloody, gruesome statuary in Catholic churches. But nevertheless, the overall message of the church is one that is heavenly and uplifting. You ever seen the churches that have like stacks of crutches and bones inside the church?
Yeah, I played at one of those. I forget the name of the König organ in the Steinfeld Abbey north of Cologne. I played there a couple of years ago, and if you went up to the altar, it was just bones, just leg bones and skulls, and the place where Bruckner and the abbey that Bruckner is buried, he's buried in a place which is just bones. Like everything down there is skulls, and it's pretty hardcore.
Modern Americans would not be comfortable with that, but you know, it's good. It's good to confront the reality of death. It's good for your spiritual life to be constantly cognizant of death. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely room for that in churches, but it's like the problem with that north transept facade at Sagrada Familia is it's like it does not look hopeful or spiritual. It looks, I mean, it would make a good Holocaust memorial, I'll put it that way. It's architecture that's designed to look like horribly broken, like frozen conflict.
Interesting.
And yeah, I mean, there are places to build structures that look like that, and you know, a Holocaust memorial might be such a place, but it's not the right note for a church. A church can have unsettled moments. It can have, you know, gargoyles. It can have little dragons and things kind of creeping out at the corners, and it can have paintings of tragedies like the martyrdoms of saints or the crucifixion of Christ, as long as contextually those are shown to be one part of the story, but that ultimately salvation triumphs. That's why I could not imagine a brutalist style church, is because the overall message of a brutalist building is like, we are in the midst of the apocalypse right now. You know, all traditional beauty has been swept away, and the only beauty that we're going to allow ourselves right now is the dark and austere beauty of the military-industrial complex. You know, that's the message of brutalist architecture. It's a message that even here, even as slaves to the military-industrial complex in the midst of the Cold War, we architects can still find some beauty, and here's what it looks like. It's a dark and terrible beauty, but there's still beauty for us. And that's an optimistic message. It's a good message. But that's not the message of Christian salvation. You're not going to build a church where that's the message.
Yeah, fair enough. Hey, and to correct the record, I don't not believe in incorruptible bodies. I just think that between Catholic and Orthodox, the Catholics need to raise their standard a little bit. There's a good percentage of those incorrupt bodies that I'm like, I don't know. That looks like it's deteriorated a little bit to me. But anyway, just didn't want to totally cast shade on the whole concept of incorruptibility there.
Well, yeah, even in the Orthodox Church, I don't think the assertion that a body is wholly or partly incorrupt is necessarily asserting a miracle. It's like, it is, to a certain extent, it's normal for bodies to not fully decay. And, you know, when you read an anecdote that, like, a coffin was opened that had some bishop in it and he was found to be 40% incorrupt, that's not necessarily asserting that the church believes that a miracle 40% occurred. It might just be, you can just take that as just an empirical observation that the body was 60% decayed and 40% not, and that's just what they saw when they opened the casket.
Fair enough. It is
on the
cool
other,
to have like
yeah.
John Damascus still around from like
Yeah.
1,500 years ago.
Well,
Like that's like
there are other
pretty
cases
crazy.
there are other cases that absolutely seem miraculous. Saint Demetrios, the Roman soldier, still sitting there in his coffin, like 1,800 years later, incorrupt and continuously exuding myrrh to the point that they have to like bail it out of the sarcophagus with a bucket periodically. It's like
where is this?
In Thessalonica, Saint Demetrios. Yeah, I mean, a story like that can be nothing but an incredible miracle. But I'm just saying, not every instance of sort of partial incorruption is necessarily being asserted as a miracle.
Yeah. What do the Orthodox do with like Catholic incorrupt miracles? Or they just go, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the Orthodox Church holds no position on Catholic saints, for instance. I mean, of course, there were exceedingly saintly people in Catholicism. No one would question the saintliness of Saint Francis, for instance. But he was canonized in a process outside the Orthodox Church. And because we don't have a mechanism for recognizing a Catholic canonization, so it's just like...
Although I think Olivia was telling me there was, like, in some border place, there were hymns to St. Thomas Aquinas.
Yes, that may be. That may be because, in the time of St. Thomas Aquinas, there was not a clear division in communion between the Eastern and Western Church.
Okay.
The schism between the East and the West occurred in stages, and the first stage, the mutual excommunications of 1054, really only was understood to apply to the two patriarchs themselves. They excommunicated each other, but that was not understood to mean that the entire Eastern and Western Church separated into two communions.
Well, is that the same now with, like, Russia and Greece?
Yes. Well, sort of.
Like, are the Russians and the Greeks out of communion now? Like, can you commune down at Holy Trinity or vice versa?
Well, I can commune either place because I'm in the OCA, and the OCA is not subject to either of those excommunications. So, yeah, I think the Russian Church has told people who are under the Russian Church to not commune at Greek churches, but it's still
like Rokor wouldn't.
Yeah, Rokor I think is supposed to not, but the OCA is not under either the Greek or the Russian patriarchs, so we can commune in both places. So yeah, it's asymmetrical communion like that is pretty common in Orthodoxy. But getting back to the schism, it's like from 1054 all the way to the Crusades, the Fourth Crusade, the break in communion was very nominal. It was really between the patriarchs. The schism got escalated to a more serious level when the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem and installed a Latin patriarch in parallel to the Greek patriarch. That was the first time that you had rival bishops of the same place. That really escalated the schism to saying, like, we don't recognize your church as the legitimate church here. And then it escalated more when the Crusaders conquered Constantinople and installed a Latin patriarch there. And the Byzantine emperor and the Byzantine patriarch went in exile to Nicaea. Then you had, two rival organizations claiming the same ecclesial jurisdiction. But even then, even all through the Middle Ages, the break in communion was somewhat nominal, because all through the Middle Ages, a Greek traveling to Italy would take communion at any church in Italy, and an Italian traveling to the Byzantine Empire would take communion at any church in the Byzantine Empire. So there was still no sense that this break in communion trickled all the way down to regular people traveling in other countries. That the schism didn't get to that level until after the failed Council of Florence and the fall of Constantinople in the 15th century. Because, like, there were some big betrayals in the 15th century where, like, the Pope promised that he would send an army to protect Constantinople as long as the Byzantine Emperor signed a document restoring communion and recognition, and then he signed the document against the wishes of his bishops, and then the Pope didn't send that army after all, and Constantinople still fell, but the Pope was still claiming that the Council of Florence was binding. And at that point, the Greek bishops pretty said, we're not having anything to do with these Italian bishops anymore. We don't trust them. We don't want anybody going to communion at their churches anymore. But yeah, again, back in the time of Thomas Aquinas, yeah, the schism was pretty nominal, and you can definitely argue that the Orthodox Church had some degree of recognition of Catholic saints in those days.
Interesting. Well, cool.
Yeah, this was a good conversation.
Yeah, thanks for talking with me. We talked for like 2 hours and 20 minutes about a bunch of crazy stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's kind of like hanging out. Except next time we do this, we should have a whiskey or brandy or something. So.
Oh yeah, Joe Rogan style, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just kind of hard to do in the middle of the day on a Thursday, you know.
That's true.
It's like, you know, but hey, thanks for coming on and doing the interview, and it's been a great conversation.
All right, take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Would you please like and subscribe? And if you're interested in more, check out my website, MatthewWilkinson.net, where you can find previous episodes, as well as a copy of my CD, Bach's Klavierübung Dritter Teil, at the Trost Organ in Waltershausen. Thanks.